Hello, everybody. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you to this event with Hasia Diner and Hing on the 1924 Immigration Act on Jewish and its impact on Asian and Jewish communities. I want to thank our co-sponsor for today's program, the Workers' Circle Arbiter Ring of Northern California. They originally suggested the program, and I'm very grateful, as immigration policy is on all of our minds, and it's helpful to understand it in its complicated and often upsetting historical context. And I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make all we do at the library possible. I hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And today's program is made possible in part by Richard and Martha Pastcan in honor of Larry Bergheimer. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll all be muted during the program, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end via Zoom's chat function. So please use the chat function to put your questions there, and I will relay them to our speakers, time permitting. So I really could go on for about 20 minutes introducing our illustrious guests, but I will keep it short. Throughout his career, University of San Francisco immigration law professor and activist Hing has pursued social justice through a combination of community work, litigation, and scholarship. His books include Humanizing Immigration, American Presidents, Deportation, and Human Rights Violations, Ethical Borders, NAFTA, Globalization, and Mexican Migration, and Deporting Our Souls, Morality, Values, and Immigration Policy. He was co-counsel in the precedent-setting U.S. Supreme Court asylum case, INS versus Cardozo-Fonseca. He is the founder of the Immigration Legal Resource Center in San Francisco, where he continues to volunteer as general counsel. Hasia Diner is director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History at New York University and the recipient of multiple National Jewish Book Awards, and one of my favorite historians. Her most recent books include Opening Doors, The Unlikely Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America, Immigration and American History, How America Met the Jews, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way, and 1929, Mapping the Jewish World. It is such a pleasure and honor to have both of them with us. And Hasia, I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank the Jewish Community Library, as well as the Circle for making this possible, and for everybody who's taken time out of their afternoon to listen to a program about immigration. So it's a real honor for me to be here. So I'm going to look at the 1924 National Origins Act. I'm going to look backward at what led up to it, because it did, in fact, represent a kind of radical change in American public life. And then I'm going to say a bit about its implications for Jews and also for others who either wanted to come to the United States and couldn't, or the communities, their ethnic communities in the United States. So the law, which is very complicated, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just say that it had first been passed in 1921 as an emergency act, and then was authorized in 1924 as it grew out of some of the issues intended upon World War I. The 24 Act was a bit different than 21 in that it assigned quotas to all nations in the world, with the exception of 8 nations in Asia. And it assigned them quotas based on, it's a really complicated formula, on the percentage of people born in that country in the 1890 census. So that is, the policymakers went, I'm sorry, 1880 census. The policymakers went back to the 1880 census and said, just give an example, if 4% of all people listed in the 1880 census had said that they were born in Denmark, then Denmark got 4%. Okay, and that, was assigned to all the nations, again, with the exception of Asian countries. And all Asian nations entered into something called the Asiatic Barred Zone. They just could not come with, there was no quota. It was a complicated process, as I said, because there were many countries on the map, okay, in 1924, which actually had not existed in 1880. So there was no country in 1880 called Poland. Poland was part of the Prussian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Tsarist Empire, and an independent Poland was a product of, in fact, World War I and the peace treaty. But be that as it may, it severely restricted immigration from Europe, okay, on the basis of a numerical formula. There was a ceiling in terms of how many immigrants could come. And there was a change in terms of how they applied for visas to come to the United States and to gain the privilege of arriving in the United States as potential citizens. Okay. I should just say before looking at the origins of it and previous legislation that the Asiatic Barred Zone had been created first in the 1917 Immigration Act. But Japan had been exempt. But Japan in 1924 now fell under that barred zone. And again, just looking back, immigrants from China or individuals from China, first with the Page Act in 1879, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, were the first group to ever be defined in the law as incapable or severely, severely restricted in being able to arrive. And further, the 1917 Act made it impossible for anyone born in Asia to become naturalized and therefore become a citizen. Okay, so the real impact of 1924 were on Europeans. So, looking backwards, there had never been any kind of national origin or specific nation-based quota or nation-based limitation on immigrants from Europe. Now, starting in the 1890s, Congress did begin to pass laws which restricted or which barred entry to people who fit into certain categories with eye diseases, lung diseases, maybe prostitutes, anarchists. They have a category called moron, people with mental and physical defects. But these were not based on national origin. And we can presume that such categories kind of were pretty evenly distributed. Eye disease may have been pretty evenly spread between all European people, and that it did not come with a restriction on any one country or any one group of people. Now, the those earlier legislation, we can begin it. It begins in the 1880s when Congress passes something called the Foran Act, which bars the entry of contract labor. And that was probably directed heavily at Italians, but also at Chinese, although the Chinese have now been excluded in 1882. And by the 1880s and the 1890s, many white, well-off Protestant Americans began to fear quite profoundly that the nation was being taken away from them, that the country was being flooded with people they defined as undesirable. And this would be Italians and Greeks and people from the Slavic lands, people who spoke Polish, Hungarian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and yes, Jews among them. Okay. If we look at the rhetoric in that period, it's very interesting that Jews, while they are certainly mentioned as undesirable, they're not quite as undesirable as some of these other peoples, Italians and Slavic immigrants in particular. In 1911, Congress, the Senate created a special committee, the Dillingham Commission, to study immigration. It came out with a 41-volume report, and it said the nation cannot accommodate so many people of such defective characters. And obviously, there's a great deal of eugenic conversation going on here, eugenic argument that some nations are more defective than others, or to put that on its head, some nations are better, are more physically and mentally and morally capable than others. And the physically, mentally, and morally able tended to be people who lived in Northern Europe. Germans, Scandinavians, the British Isle, and those who were more defective tended to come from, again, Italy and Greece and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Tsarist Empire and the like. So this trend towards restriction was growing since the 1880s, and again, towards and again, I know Bill will talk about this because his subject has certainly been Chinese immigration, on immigration from Asia. But in terms of European immigration, the move towards restriction was growing, but it was growing in ways that the proposed legislation, whether it passed or it didn't pass, was not defined in national or what were called racial terms. Okay. And so in the 1921 and 1924 acts were quite a radical departure, both in terms of creating this quota system, putting a numerical ceiling on how many immigrants could come, and assigning those quotas, assigning those percentages to specific countries. And so that's, in a very complex piece of legislation, it is in a sense the essence of the law. Now, the law had tremendous impact for all Americans who themselves or their families had come from any of those places in the world. Okay, it meant that people, while immediate family members were allowed in outside of the quota, parents and children and spouses. Okay. Other than that, families were not able to reconstitute in the United States. Places in Europe which were experiencing economic difficulties could no longer turn to the United States as a possible, shall we call it, safety valve or an escape for the people back home who wanted to come to the United States for a plethora of reasons. So one thing, and this is certainly going to hold true for Jews as well, in fact, for Jews, is that all of those ethnic communities, again, the Greek and the Italian and the Polish and the Hungarian and the Lithuanian and so on, they were kind of frozen. That is, no new people were coming from abroad. Languages tended to begin to decline. Okay, that is, there are no new Italian speakers, there are no new Greek speakers, or no new Yiddish speakers coming to the United States. And so, what you have in the period after the 20s, it goes into effect in the latter part of the decade. And so, by the 1930s, what you see is these are sort of frozen ethnic groups. Okay, rather than communities that had fresh influxes of new immigrants. So it's very interesting, and we'll turn to the specific impact on Jews immediately. Is that by 1930 we have for the first time since, in fact, the 18th century, very long period of time, the first time that a majority of Jews in the United States were American born. Okay, that is, there are no new immigrants coming in. And so it is a population made of increasingly American-born Jews, and therefore English-speaking Jews, okay, and Jews who have become increasingly integrated into American society. Now, this again held for all the other communities as well. Now, the case of the Jews. Now, I frequently give talks in community audiences, and somebody does raise their hand and say, "Okay, after all that, what was the Jewish quota?" Okay, and it should be very clear there was no Jewish quota. Jews came in on the same quota as people, or in the same number, the same slots from the countries in which they lived: Poland, Romania, Hungary. Okay, and I should also want to add that we have no evidence. Okay, now maybe somebody could someday do this research, but here to date, there is no evidence that a Jew applying for a visa to the United States at the American consulate in Budapest had less of a chance of getting in than a Catholic applying for a visa at that same embassy. So there's no evidence that Jews were discriminated in this. And specifically, although certainly the countries in which they lived and from which so many of them wanted to leave were countries that got low quotas. Okay, although not the lowest. And again, Italy got a much lower quota than Poland. Greece got a radically lower quota than Hungary. So the two, Italy and Greece, places where there were relatively few Jews who living there and seeking to come to the United States. Now, what makes the case of the Jews not only sui generis and particularly poignant in a historical sense is that, when this law is passed in 1924, nobody, neither the Jews, nor the members of Congress, nor American public opinion, nor the labor movement, which actually supported the immigration restriction because they wanted to keep out unskilled laborers, none of them could anticipate what was going to happen in Europe as of 1933. Okay, they could, it was beyond the imaginable that the state of the Jews, okay, the condition of the Jews was going to not only, I think deteriorate is a really too mild a word to describe what engulfed the Jews of Germany and Austria, and then Czechoslovakia, and then the lands to the east with the rise of Nazism, both German Nazism, proto-Nazis, Nazis in many of these other countries, as well as the war and the final solution. So it was a unintended and obviously horrendous implication of a law that, again, thought of Jews as people that the lawmakers didn't want, but not specifically. But we might say Jews felt the sting a decade later of that legislation in a way that was unintended and unexpected. Okay, so we know that in the period after the law was passed, American Jewish communal leaders and American Jewish communal organizations did what they could to try to mitigate the situations of individual Jews seeking entry into the United States, but their hands were tied. Okay, and there was no wiggle room in the law. And every time in the 1930s and early 1940s, obviously after the United States went to war in 1941, there was nothing that could be done. But every time there was discussion of trying to change the law or to mitigate it, it came up against a kind of brick wall of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. Okay, and so again, to just keep in mind, the law went into effect in 1928. 1 year later, the world and the United States is gripped by the Great Depression. a period of time in which American public opinion was absolutely adamant that we do not want new immigrants. We don't care who they are. We do not want more people coming into this country to compete for the shrinking numbers of jobs which exist here, which should go to Americans. So that the law as passed, and I'm going to kind of draw this to a close, and I anticipate, and I look forward to questions. The law again passed in 1924, a dramatic change in American policy, went into effect in 1928, was immediately confronted with the realities of the Great Depression, and then just a few years later, the rise of the Nazi regime in Europe and Hitler's conquest of the rest of Europe. So it was a law that impacted Jews, but it impacted all Europeans, so many of whom also got caught in these same forces so beyond anyone's control. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Hasia. And also, I want to thank the organizers for the kind invitation for me to join all of you today. Just want to reiterate a couple things and then move us on beyond 1924. One, by the time of the 1924 Act, Asian immigration to the United States pretty much had come to an end. There one of the provisions in the 1924 Act that hammered that home was a provision that no one who was anyone ineligible for naturalization could immigrate. Let me repeat that. There's a provision in the 1924 Act that anyone ineligible for naturalization would be eligible to immigrate. And that was a backhanded way of making sure that no Asians could immigrate, because the naturalization laws had been amended so that eventually, after the Civil War, for example, that free black slaves could apply, and there was a debate in Congress at the end of the Civil War, when the Civil War amendments were enacted, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, there was a debate over whether or not Chinese specifically could get naturalized. And there was a specific debate over that. And Congress made it very clear that no Asians would be eligible for naturalization, even though they may have theretofore been lawful immigrants to the United States. So by saying in the 1924 Act that anyone ineligible for naturalization could qualify to immigrate, that made it very clear that no Asian could immigrate. And it was especially a message sent to Japanese, because even though the Japanese were arguably covered by the Asiatic Barred Zone in 1917, there actually it still was not that clear. But this made it very clear that no longer Japanese could immigrate to the United States. And so, as Hasia points out, the world didn't anticipate, in 1924, the world didn't anticipate the Second World War. The world didn't anticipate the economic upheaval in the United States that became the Depression. And so both of those major events do affect immigration policy in both mostly negative, but also positive ways. And I'll get to that in a minute. But what Hasia has outlined serves as a reminder to all of us of two things. One, Congress has plenary power over immigration. Congress can pretty much pass any immigration law it wants. And that was first very much established and debated over the Chinese Exclusion Act. It necessitated the Supreme Court ruling on the legality, the constitutionality of the Chinese Exclusion Act when it reached the Supreme Court in the 1890s, and the Supreme Court made it very clear that Congress has plenary power over immigration, including power to make laws that are racist. And so that's a big deal. And the other big deal is that Congress can come up with its own scheme of immigration. It doesn't have to be quote unquote fair. It doesn't have to be egalitarian. It can be discriminatory in other ways. And so we've long, in spite of the inscription on the Statute of Limitations, on the Statute of Liberty, we've long excluded people who are poor. There's always been a ground of exclusion for somebody who's likely to become a public charge. And that was included in the earlier laws, but also in the 1924 Act. And so we can be classist and we can be racist, and we can determine areas of the world that people can immigrate from, as embodied in the 1924 Act. And so in combination with the various Asian exclusion laws that began with the Chinese stuff, but then it went to the gentleman's agreement that excluded Japanese, to eventually, even after in the middle of World War II, there's legislation that passed that ultimately leads to the exclusion of Filipinos. Okay, so, and that actually happens in the middle of World War II. So the 1924 Act embodies this ability to pick and choose how many folks can come from different parts of the world. And as Hasia points out, the ideal that the policymakers came up with in the 1920s, the ideal demographic makeup of the country was 1890. And so whatever the demographic, how the country looked in 1890, well, we wanted to replicate that again. And I can't, so that's why, as Hasia pointed out, that there's a small percentage from Denmark. Well, that's how many come, but it favored Western Europeans because, of course, Western Europeans dominated the 1890 census. And what we see after that is that this decision to try to emulate what existed in 1890, to me, it's when somebody says, let's make America great again, I often believe that what that phrase means, that it's code word for looking back in time at a time when the person who's making that statement views the country as ideal in the eyes of that particular person. And I'm not sure what somebody who is saying that, what period of time that person is thinking of, but I'm fairly confident that a person who's making a statement like that is thinking of a particular racial makeup of the country, and that what that person sees today does not make that person happy. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, and I think that's manifested in the type of immigration enforcement that we're witnessing firsthand today. So when World War II started, the wars make a big difference in immigration policy. You point to a war that has existed, that the United States has been involved in, and I will point to a change in an immigration law that resulted as a result of that war. And one of the results of World War II was the cancellation of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that the Chinese repealer was passed in 1942. Why? Because Japan was leafleting China and saying, how can you form an alliance with the United States when the United States is excluding your people? And sure enough, Congress enacted the Chinese repealer to get rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act as a result of the need to align with China. The same thing happened with India around that time. And so it didn't mean big numbers, but it did mean that there was that led to the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The other thing that happened during World War II, and it caused strange bedfellows, and it was respect to the Philippines, which the United States owned as a result of the Spanish-American War that ended in 1898. The United States took over the Philippines, and by doing that, Filipinos became nationals of the United States. They're odd category. They're non-citizen nationals. They were not US citizens fully, but they were nationals. And as nationals, they could come and go in and out of the United States. And that led to, just like every other Asian group before, that led to an anti-Filipino movement in the United States. And even though the Philippines were an ally of the United States during World War II, that led to strange bedfellows, that Philippine nationalists and immigrant exclusionists in the United States formed a partnership to pass the Philippine Exclusion Act, and that's the Philippine Independence Act that was passed, and it gave 12 years notice to Filipinos in the United States. You're gonna have to make a decision in 12 years, because otherwise in 12 years, you're gonna lose your national status. And so that's how the Philippines became an independent nation. And it was because of that kind of alliance during World War II. So the fact that the 1924 Act and the Asian stuff before that enabled Congress and emboldened Congress to pass different laws that, in my view, were very racist in their object, it led to odd things. One thing that it led to is immigration enforcement against Mexicans in the United States. So between 1929 and 1939, there was a Mexican repatriation program where the estimates are very widely, but the estimate is somewhere between 300,000 and 2 million. 300,000 and 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported or repatriated from the United States, most from the Los Angeles area. And that was between the 10-year period, 1929 to 1939. And the estimate is 40 to 60% of those Mexicans that were repatriated were US citizens, mostly children. And so, of course, if you understand immigration law, you can't be deported if you're a US citizen. Well, I will correct you. And I will say that every day, including tomorrow, including on Friday, we deport people from this country whose children go along with them. And those children are US citizens. So in fact, every day we do engage in the de facto deportation of US citizens. And it's usually the children. And believe me, the current administration knows that. The current administration knows that there are many, many deportable immigrants in the United States who have US citizen children, and they're going to take their children with them. The other thing that led to, and this is the love-hate relationship between the United States and immigrants, and that's often manifested in our temporary worker programs and work categories. And so there was a need for low-wage workers, and that one of the ways that got manifested was in the Bracero program that ran from 1942 to 1964, and close to 5 million Braceros came into the United States during that period of time. Of course, there's a lot of rich literature written about the Bracero program that is fascinating to read, and most of it's not pretty. Most of it is about the exploitation of those workers. But when we were finished, when the United States was finished with those workers, well, we turned around and deported them under a program called Operation Wetback. And that began in 1954. It was a mass deportation of Mexican nationals again. Over 1 million persons were deported under Operation Wetback back to Mexico. I'm going to fast forward now to when I started practicing immigration law, and that was more than 50 years ago. I started practicing immigration law in 1974, and at that time, I learned very, very quickly that that the anti-immigrant stuff that was happening then was about Mexican, anti-Mexican stuff. Believe me, I've represented my fair share of Chinese and Asians that have been deported as well. But most of the anti-immigrant stuff that I've witnessed is targeting Mexicans. And I know that many of you are going to start throwing things at me at this time, but I think that many in the anti-immigrant camp that have seen Central Americans come in the last 10, 20, 30 years, they cannot distinguish between Mexicans and other Latinos. They see somebody speaking Spanish and they think they're Mexican, okay, even though they're from Venezuela or El Salvador or Guatemala. And so I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I can point to you many provisions in the immigration law that were enacted because of an anti-Mexican feeling, including making it a misdemeanor to enter the country illegally back in the 1940s, well, and 50s, when, of course, who was crossing without documents? Well, it was Mexicans. And there's a provision today that makes it very difficult for, you would think that if you marry a US citizen, you can get your green card. And you would mostly be right. But the problem is if you entered without inspection, even if you're married to a US citizen, you cannot get a green card without having to leave the country for 10 years. That requirement is definitely an anti-Mexican provision, because who entered without inspection? Well, it's Mexicans. Again, just to fast forward a little bit more to what we're seeing today, and those of you who are in the Bay Area, I know that if you've paid attention at all to the news in the last several days, we were whipsawed around because he's enigmatic, but you know, our friendly billionaire, Mr. Benioff, who has donated so much money to great causes in the Bay Area, well, for some crazy reason, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, he invited the president to send a National Guard to San Francisco. And then the president said, I'll do that. And then the president said, at the same time, I'm going to do ICE raids beginning yesterday, Saturday, the 25th. And so immigrant rights groups were gearing up for all that. And then on it must have been Wednesday morning, or maybe it was Tuesday, Mr. Benioff changed his mind, and I guess the week before he changed his mind when his conference was in town, and he backed off on the National Guard thing. And then he and another billionaire friend, Jonathan Wong from NVIDIA, they called the president on Tuesday or Wednesday and said, you know what, let's not send National Guard or immigration. And then Mayor Lurie had a conversation with the president on Wednesday night. And of course, Mayor Lurie is claiming credit for convincing the president to back off on immigration enforcement. Honestly, I don't know who among us knows the mind of the current president. But so I don't know why he changed his mind. My money is on the money man. that he changed his mind because Benioff and Jonathan Wong called him, but maybe Mayor Lurie deserves some credit as well. But at the end of the day, the immigration enforcement didn't happen, the widespread sweeps. But let me end there. I just want all of you to know that immigrants and also those of us in the immigrant rights community, we're not giving up. We are embattled. We feel like we're at war. And it's one new thing after another every day that the administration is tossing at us. This time around, it's 100 times worse than the first time around, and it's only been 9 months. And so stay tuned, because this isn't over. And I think the basis for all of this was what Hasia started with in the beginning, is that Congress has this vast power, and the president feels that he can take that power and use it administratively as well. Let me stop there.
Well, thanks so much to both of you. So I do have a few questions, and I invite folks to put their questions in the chat, and I will ask those questions. So I'm going to begin with one from David Fisher. He asks, will you talk about the role of the eugenics movement in immigration restriction, e.g. Madison Grant, Benedict Davenport, Francis Galton, et cetera?
Okay, so the rise of the anti-immigration movement, we usually date it to 1893, and the formation in Boston of the Immigration Restriction League actually was a kind of age mate with the rise of, and I'm going to use my quote marks here with my fingers, scientific racism, which is another way of saying eugenics. And, eugenics meant good birth. And many of the members of the Immigration Restriction League also belonged to some eugenic society or another. And there was a pretty widespread movement among that sort of white, well-off Protestant, heavily New England class. And they read the science. This is how they read the science, qualities that were mental and moral were just as heritable as other characteristics that an individual might have, how tall they were going to get or whatever. And that it behooved the guardians of society, the policymakers, and the educated and moral leaders to ensure that the nation would have only the strongest and only the most mentally fit in its living within its boundaries. Eugenics was very widely accepted as an idea, and the idea again that some people are just defective, and now some people there was nothing that could be done about them, and there were, by the way, many studies done about people we would call mountain people. They used to be called hillbillies. That is the people of Appalachia. That was like the first most important study was about that particular population, but they were now 8, 9, 10 generations American. Okay, so there was nothing that could be done about them, although there was there was a process of voluntary and sometimes not voluntary sterilization. These people should not be allowed to reproduce. But immigrants, now there was something they could do something about. Okay, that is, they could say Italians, the Italian race, or they sometimes called it the Latin race, or the Mediterranean races. Okay, they're among the defective. And what can we do about them? We keep them out. And so this was very much in the minds of the restrictionists, from that first meeting of the Immigration Restriction Society, was to weed out the bad and encourage the fit and the competent.
Thank you. So Yael Javier has a question about she notes that her maternal grandfather, a rabbi, and the family emigrated from Bialystok in 1926. So what were the exceptions, or how many, what did it really look like in terms of Jews who did leave, in this case, Poland, during those years?
So, for one thing, were we to do a study of this, were we to talk about this, what's important to know is, did they have immediate family in the United States? Because if you had a child, a spouse, okay, a parent, you could come in without being dealing with the quota system. The other, and I don't see who asked the question, but she said, Rabbi, clergy were exempt. Interestingly, the clergy were exempt. And so, if your grandfather was a rabbi in Bialystok, he would not have to be subjected to the quota system.
That's really interesting, especially that so many Jews were ordained as rabbis as a matter of course. Was that something that people ever sought to exploit in order to be able to immigrate?
For sure. And even if they weren't, they could claim, that they were clergy. So, I mean, it was a great loophole. And one of the things that's actually really interesting in the 1930s, again, under the shadow of Nazism, is Jews were seeking to leave Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia. There was actually a fairly substantial influx of rabbis from those places and cantors, and because they did not have to be charged to the quota system. So probably the percentage of clergy who came in was greater than the percentage of the clergy who were actually there and functioning.
Great, thank you.
And by the
Uh,
way, it was true in the Chinese Exclusion Act also. Ministers were not excluded. And again, it was a little bit of a kind of loophole, little.
Great, thanks. Bill, Yitzhak Kerem had a question about clarifying about the Philippines, since there was a time of Japanese rule, and so he's asking when it had that pro-American status.
From 1898 to the Philippine Independence Act, which was 1934, they were considered, well, during the time that the Philippines might have been occupied by Japan, they were still US territory, okay? But yeah, as non-citizen nationals, they could come into the United States and come and go as they pleased, and that caused resentment in some quarters. Yeah, I also see a question, Howard, in the chat, the difference between citizenship and naturalization. So citizenship you acquire by being born in the United States. The exception to that is if you're born to a foreign official family. Or you can acquire citizenship at birth through a US citizen mother or father if you're born abroad. It depends on when that happened because the requirements are different. If you're born out of wedlock out of the United States, it's different from a mother who's a citizen or a father. But you can acquire citizenship at birth abroad through a citizen father or mother. And of course, if you're born in the United States, and that's very controversial, birthright citizenship. But naturalization is the term that's used for people who are lawful immigrants of the United States. They have so-called green card, they've immigrated, or they came as a refugee and then get a green card a year later. After you've lived here for X numbers of years, either 3 to 5 years, depending on how you got your lawful permanent residence, you apply for naturalization. You have to be of good moral character. You have to pass the history and government test, and that's called citizenship through naturalization.
Great, thank you very much. So a question from Andy Muchin and Laura Rosenberg. The question, so when did the idea, or perhaps the myth, that the United States is a land of immigrants arise? And how widely supported is that idea in the United States today? This could be for either of you.
Well, I mean, in a way, it really was a nation of immigrants. And if you mean that the every person living in the United States, except for the indigenous people, people who had all who
And slaves, right?
yeah, and well, and slaves were not voluntary, obviously, in any manner, but otherwise, every single, I mean, George Washington's family were immigrants. There was everybody, all white people and Asians came from someplace else. And while we, spend a lot of time, and I don't like to be Pollyanna-ish, and positive, but the fact is there was always a counter tradition to nativism. There was always a kind of ethos, a cadre of Americans who celebrated the diversity and who thought it was a really good thing. And it's this tug of war, it's the love-hate relationship. But the fact is, statistically, most people in the United States can look back at their family's origins, and they began in some other country, and they involve the decision of some family member, some great, 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 whatever number back to choose the United States. And again, for most of the United States history, putting the case of the Chinese and other Asians to the side, which obviously one should never put it to a side, but for Europeans until 1921, it was a seamless process. And so in the era of what we call the Ellis Island immigration, so from the 1890s through, only 2% of all European immigrants were barred from entry.
Yeah,
No, I'm sorry,
I would
2%
ask all this. It's been a while since my children are all in the 40s, but I remember looking at my daughter's fifth grade, I don't know what it was, social studies book or something. And a chapter, of course, is titled A Nation of Immigrants. And so that's what continues to be taught, I think, in schools. But Nathan Glazer kind of put it best in the foreword to one of his books, which is the United States is a permanently unfinished country. And the way I put it, it's an experiment. The United States is an experiment, and many people don't like the way that the United States was evolving, and the debate over immigration has been with us since the very beginning, and it's going to continue.
And they don't like the way it's evolving, but they like the way it had been when their family came in. Okay. And they
Good point.
understand that their family also had come from someplace else, and they were good immigrants. The problem is, and these are obviously not my words, that the people who are coming now, let's say 1890 or 1910, they're not as good as we were.
Yeah,
We could
Hasia,
have been
I'm
let
glad that you
in.
say that because, and I don't know any of you on this call really, although I see Laurel there and I had coffee with her the other day. But I listen. As I said, I've been working with different immigrant groups for many years, and honestly, the vast, vast, vast majority of the people that I've helped, they're good people. They are coming here to work. They want to put food on the table. They're not coming here to commit crimes or get welfare. They are, they're just wonderful people. And even going to the border, the folks at my clinic and I meet on the other side of the border, they're the poster child of the anti-immigrant movement right now. They are people that they're human beings, and they're no different, honestly, from any of us. They want the best things for their families. They want to work. They want to live in a peaceful situation.
I mean, Bill, if I could just, I know we have other questions, but I want to say that there's absolutely no difference between an immigrant from one place and an immigrant from another. It is the same phenomenon. There's no difference in an immigrant who came from Norway and somebody who came from Greece or from China. They may speak different languages. They may have, but the constellation of motives, the way in which they went about building their lives in America were so powerfully similar. but the notion that there were good immigrants and bad immigrants is in the minds, was in the minds, and is in the minds of those who are unhappy with what is at the moment.
Thank you. So Diana, Scott has a question. How did these two communities, and maybe we could talk about both within also the different communities within the Asian communities and then across other immigrant communities, how did they support each other politically after 1924? Or did the Depression prevent that kind of united front as may be happening now?
Well, I mean, again, I'll start, Bill, and obviously, please either interrupt or. But in terms of the 1924 moment, what's very striking is how little cooperation or joint action or united action there was between the Jews, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Italians. They each did it. They each tried to lobby against the legislation. They each tried to impact their congressional representation representatives, but they never really got together and said, you know, actually, if we work together, we are an enormous front. There are so many of us. They did not do that, and they operated in their own communal boundaries. And
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Hasia. I'm not, I can't add anything more. The only thing I would say is that it's interesting that both Harry Truman, Harry Truman actually was very critical of the 1924 Act. In fact, he vetoed the 1952 Act because it didn't get rid of the quota system. And John Kennedy, when he was a young senator, he wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants that criticized the 1924 Act, and he introduced legislation in his first, I think it was his first year in office, and after he was assassinated, there was worry that his vision wouldn't continue, and Johnson didn't. Johnson came through and did push for the 1965 Act. It wasn't the same vision as John Kennedy's, but he did get it through. But I give a lot of credit to those three presidents: Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson for really seeing the 1924 Act as totally wrong.
You know, and I say that the 1965 Act was named the Hart-Celler Act, and Emanuel Celler, a Jewish congressman from Brooklyn, entered Congress in 1922 and spoke passionately against the law, as did all the Jewish Congress people, the few Italians who served in Congress, and they actually had a lot of support from Irish senators and congressmen, but it wasn't enough. They were just too weak a force to stem the tide. The tide was just, it seemed just it was unstoppable.
Thank you. So Michael Rice notes that his father, James Rice, was the executive director of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, from 1956 to 66. And Michael learned that there were quotas that barred entry to 8,000 immigrants in transit from European ports with valid visas. And his father was instrumental in addressing those and helping them come. But if you could perhaps talk about that particular Hasia.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know that particular case, and I'd obviously be fascinated to know more, but organizations like HIAS were terribly important to defend the rights of, again, they were in no position to change the law. They couldn't change the law. As Bill told us, this is Congress's power. But organizations like HIAS were worked tirelessly, okay, to defend the rights of immigrants coming in case by case by case, okay, to prevent deportation. Okay, and they had lawyers, they had social workers, they had a whole panoply of professionals. And again, I think one of the things, again, because they're citizens, And because they had some political visibility, which those immigrant groups, which were not citizens, obviously the China, didn't have that same power, didn't have that same ability to impact the day-to-day operations of the ports of immigration, the ports of entry.
Thank you. Um, Diana had asked a follow-up question, which was a question for both of you. To what degree did the linguistic diversity serve as an obstacle to, for these groups to communicate with each other and also to be effective in advocating for themselves?
Uh,
Yeah,
Probably. Okay, Bill, please.
well, no, just quickly, Hasia, that's, of course, that's a problem. I mean, that's even a problem today among the immigrant rights groups, although there's good efforts to bring people together, but language differences has always been a challenge for organizing.
Yeah, and so I mean, in all of those communities, again, the Jews, the Italians, they had another generation of English, those who were knowledgeable, who were English speakers, who certainly, and there was an English press in all of those communities. But yeah, 1924, most Italians were still Italian speakers. And so their ability to communicate with members of Congress, with the public, with across ethnic lines was definitely hampered.
Great, thank you. So I'm getting through a few more questions. David Goldstein wonders asks, why do you think the United States did not adopt a Kindertransport policy, such akin to England's initiative during World War II?
Right. I mean, obviously it's shameful. And not that England was a bastion of philo-Semitism. It's not that the English were so wonderful to in kind of day-to-day institutional life towards Jews. But they took a position that the United States, there were several bills in front of Congress, the Norris-Rogers Act, which was to admit Jewish orphans from Central Europe, and it just could not get through Congress. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing one can say positive about it. And it's almost like other than the sentiment was so great. We're not taking in children. We're not taking immigrants. We don't care if they're children.
Yeah. Susan Goldstein notes in looking at her own family's immigration background, she wonders whether siblings were allowed without the quota that came
No,
into
it
force in
was
1924.
parents, children, and spouses.
Mhm.
Now, if there was a sibling, if somebody applied for a visa, a sibling would be very good and they got through the part of the way through the process to be able to guarantee that they would take financial responsibility and they would, for the immigrant, and that immigrant would not become a public charge. And so that gave somebody who had siblings who were willing to sign such affidavits, it gave an advantage, but they were still charged to the quota.
Yeah, siblings were added as a category in 1965.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So I see one recommendation of the book, The Guarded Gate, that relates to the eugenics movement. I want to let everybody know that tomorrow we'll be sending out a reading list related to this topic. That'll be one of them, the books you can get at the Jewish Community Library and elsewhere, and some other resources for exploring this topic. I'm going to move us towards closing, so I want to ask Hasia and Bill if there's anything that you want to leave us with.
Well, there's so much, but I would just say that, as a historian, I study the past, but I am an activist in my own little way as well. And when I go to meetings and when I go to demonstrations and when I carry placards saying we welcome immigrants, I'm acting as a human being. I'm acting as a Jew. I'm acting as the child of immigrants. Both of my parents were born in Ukraine, and I'm acting also with somebody of the historical knowledge that all immigrants have been good to America. All immigrants have been good for America, and they have only enriched us and made the nation what it is.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here. I would say that if you want to get in, well, show up. Okay. I think that if you're able to, uh, the protests that have occurred have been largely peaceful, and I would showing up, I think, is very important. And there are volunteer opportunities. There's accompaniment programs that in the Bay Area, at least, Faith in Action and another organization called Interfaith Community Group, and various churches and synagogues have accompaniment programs where you can sign up to, you don't have to do anything dangerous. Some folks are accompanying people to their immigration courts hearings. Others are accompanying them, helping them take their kids to school, going to medical appointments, that type of thing, because people are afraid of doing everyday things, and it's important if somebody goes with them, they feel safer.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you to the Workers' Circle, and thanks to everybody out there who joined us today. Very appreciative, and I wish all of you well, and let's hope for a better day.
Thank you very much for having
Thank
us.
you.
Bye-bye.